Mhm. Mhm. Hello. Mhm. Hello.
Yeah, I think like one of the most I think common narratives is that Hamas, we can describe them as imperfect resistance, but they are legitimate resistance, like liberation movement, and therefore, like it would be, what's the word I'm looking for? It would be very like biased towards the West to condemn them for like acts of terrorism, for example.
Yep.
Um, which is it's another one of those things that I feel like, and so once you establish that narrative, you need to like legitimize that narrative through historical references. And so I know you're familiar with this, but they bring up like Nelson Mandela a lot,
Yep.
and they bring up like the ANC in South Africa, and um, this to me is a very problematic comparison.
Mhm.
And I would love to get into it with you more because I'm sure you're just much more capable of kind of diving into the minutia there. But like the ANC, for example, like they were basically Marxists. They weren't like avowed Marxists, but they had aligned themselves with Marxist organizations all over the world
Mhm.
for decades, including the PLO. Hamas are a group of religious extremists who uh, declare as their goal the complete usurpation of the entire, from the river to the sea through Islamic law, and then rule over that with Islamic law. I mean, they talked about. I know Bad Empanada did a video where he's talking about you. He mentioned me very briefly, discussing Nelson Mandela,
Mhm.
and it seems like these in service of their narrative, in service of their narrative that like Hamas is imperfect resistance, but we have to support them because they're a liberation movement, and they're like ANC, right? So they do this comparison, but uh,
Hmm.
Mandela wasn't exactly like he wasn't exactly unclear about how he felt about terrorism.
Yep.
You can't find a single quote from him endorsing like full on terrorism. And it's true that you had certain people within ANC who were uh, granted amnesty during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And some people, there was one guy in particular, I think his name was McBride. He did this bombing. He had targeted a bar because he thought that it was a hotspot for like off duty.
Yeah. Yeah.
What were the security?
He
Right.
thought it was
Yeah.
like
And
fucking air like pilots or something. Yeah. Yeah. Or
and he
security
ended up
officials.
killing
Yeah.
like he ended up killing like 20 civilians. Like
Mhm.
I don't even think a single military target was killed during that strike. He was put on trial for that and found guilty and sentenced to death, and but was granted amnesty through
Uh-huh.
the Truth and Reconciliation Commission because at the time they were just saying like anybody who did political violence up to a certain standard or whatever could come forward, just account for what they did, and they were basically granted for forgiveness at the time.
Yeah. It's not even
But
that. It's like within the conflict as well. During the when apartheid was still standing in the mid 80s, but 10 years before it collapsed, the when those deaths were happening and when those attacks were taking place, where there was like the Church Street bombing as well, which was just like horrible intel, where they thought that it was like I think it was something, I think it was
right,
the Air Force they were going after, but yeah, it just they killed civilians. Or like the land mining, which they had intended to use against like personnel carriers and tanks. I think they had to call that off after 2 years because like 22 people died and 21 of them were civilians, right? So, but the difference is that when those civilians were dying, within the conflict still ongoing, the ANC said, we don't want to kill civilians. We're trying to avoid civilian casualties. And then
yeah,
they a few people lost their positions. They were demoted. There was like a rearrangement. They literally dispatched all the fucking commanders to all the different units, and all in exile. They did this, by the way, to remind people of what their ethics were and like what was a legitimate target and what wasn't. Because unfortunately, disciplining people when you're a leadership in exile is very difficult. But they tried anyway, and they did this when, like, 1 year I think 70 people died, mostly civilian. And that's too much. We need to like rein this in. And they did. It's like, it's ironic that Baden Panada would try to like claim that as something that would support his position, because if you pushed him, he hates the ANC, really. He thinks he would be the kind of person that said like they compromised too much by allowing the whites to stay. He wants an Algerian solution, not a South African one. So that's fucking retarded. But yeah, no.
He also ran cover for Mandela, like on a couple different points that I thought were very dubious points that he made. So the first one he made was, you know, obviously like you and me will cite the speech that he gave during his trial, where he very, very explicitly, very clearly lays out his logic, his reasoning for why they didn't want to do terrorism. So there were 4 different types of violence, right? There was like sabotage, terrorism, and then like revolution, like war, right? And his thinking was, if we did, he wasn't even, in my mind when I read that letter and I read the whole transcript, he wasn't even necessarily making a moral argument against terrorism. He was coming at it more from a practical perspective. He was saying that if we do terrorism, it's going to make our goal of reunification difficult. If the country spirals into out and out civil war, then we are moving away from our goal. So he was just attacking it from a very like practical perspective. But Baden Panada was saying that he was only saying that because he was on trial and he was trying to avoid the death penalty. Okay. But if you look at his rhetoric throughout, like, you know, you can find quotes from his. Obviously, he became like way more anti-violence towards the end of his life after they had sort of like already accomplished that goal. But you just straight up cannot find any quotes of him saying that violence against civilians was acceptable. And when you point that out online, or when I pointed that out online, I had so many people coming in my mentions posting quotes of Mandela saying that violence could at some point become necessary, and in fact had become necessary in their struggle against apartheid.
Yeah, because these people think like there's violence and there's being Gandhi. That's the only binary. Yeah, it's stupid. Yeah, it doesn't make any fucking sense. Yeah. Mandela wasn't saying that to avoid the death penalty. Mandela said that because that's what they were doing. Things did escalate after the 60s. So in the 70s and 80s, the ANC would occasionally target military and police personnel. They did do that, although most of that was outside of South Africa, like in Rhodesia. It was still, I think the South African police at the end of the conflict logged like 1,500 ANC operations, right? And 250 people died. So even at the peak of it, they were still mostly targeting infrastructure, mostly. So yeah, the fact that they escalated towards killing police officers and security officials, like and military, but they never targeted civilians as a matter of policy. That's the difference. Just because some fighters did, and when they did, that was dealt with. They didn't have much of an infrastructure to jail them or anything, but they literally did like a whole reining in, and this was public. I can show you an article from the New York Times in 1987 when the ANC are like publicly announcing that they're doing this and that they don't want civilians to get hit. So you can, and then they did. The deaths went down like immediately after. So it's they weren't just saying it for PR.
Mandela is kind of an interesting person I'll say questionable person to invoke if you're like strictly anti-Zionist, because Mandela himself never identified as a Zionist, but he absolutely, whether that be because of just practical considerations or sort of just like a support for the state of Israel broadly or whatever, but he came out and said, you can find a quote. I found a quote from him in 1999. Israel had occupied some land in Lebanon, I think. Yeah. And there was a question about like whether or not Israel would cede that territory and withdraw. And you can find a quote from it in 1990. Again, this is like well into the conflict at this point. And he basically says that it's reasonable that Israel would hang on to that land until they got assurances from the neighboring Arab countries that they wouldn't try to attack or invade. He stressed, I mean, he was a stalwart supporter of the PLO and the general like cause of Palestinian liberation, but he at no point said that he was open to a one-state solution, as far as I'm aware.
No.
And at no point did he say that Israel didn't have a right to, in his own words, be secure within their own borders.
Well, he also went further. I think in 1993, one of his speeches was about literally supporting Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, like the legitimacy of Zionism and Israel as a Jewish state. He even affirmed that. So, yeah, it's like,
well, a lot of like civil rights leaders in the United States, for example, they sympathize with the Jewish plight. Like Rosa Parks, MLK, yeah, they identified with like Jewish persecution and they backed Israel. Like, pretty sure both Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King were like, they were definitely self-avowed Zionists. But anyways, like the other, well, anyway, I wanted to circle back to like, so when you find yourself on the receiving end of this sort of like mob, this angry mob, what do you do? Do you not look at Twitter for a little bit? Do you sort of swim in it? How do you decide when you're going to engage?
Just antagonize them more. I don't know. Depends. Depends on what mood I'm in. It's pretty random. I don't. Yeah, it's for me. It's not that hard for me to opt out of it because, like, there are other things in life that I like doing as well as fighting with crazy people. So, and I'm kind of in a position now where, like, I don't know, like sometimes I will just like deliberately throw out like edgy claims, like just because I kind of want to excise this kind of people from my community. And I've been very, like, over the last 1 or 2 years, I've just been very, very relentless in making sure that that kind of like, there are typical like behavior patterns that I notice, and they happen on right wingers as well, but like that I just look out for and just purge like as quickly as possible, because I don't want these people. I don't like them in my community. I don't want them fucking like trying to sway me. I just don't want to be involved with them really, apart from as like antagonists. So yeah, I'm okay with that. But yeah, it's just like depends on whether I'm up for getting into the stress or not, rolling in the mud. The thing with Mandela I was going to say as well is, like, you ever heard of a concept called idol grabbing?
No.
There's this thing where ideologues will fight over popular figures from history and just kind of summarize all of their worldviews down to this little post-it note to use them to validate the things that they support right now.
Oh, yeah.
So, like, Mandela,
like the letter from the Birmingham jail for MLK.
Yeah, everyone, So right wingers do it and left wingers do it with MLK, right? Even though MLK was probably like dem sock dem, like he wasn't
That's
really
right.
further than that. Yeah. They do it with Mandela, which is very easy to do with Mandela because Mandela was an incredible statesman. He was friends with everyone, right? So he would say all these things about Zionism and Israel, very supportive, but at the same time, he would also be very friendly with people who wanted to destroy Israel, right? He would actually spend quite a lot of time hanging out with not just PLO people, because they were kind of different back then, but this was like, he would even go along with like PFLP types or friendly relations with the FLN. But he was also very friendly with the Queen, like on first name terms with the Queen. Not many people were. So yeah, that's why people will just try to take whatever like minutia from people like that and seize it for themselves, which is, again, like the fact is that if Mandela were actually saying the things back then that he says now, yeah, he would be seen as like a fucking shitlib. Yeah, he would be. It's easier to claim someone in death than it is when they're still talking, you know, because you can put more
Twitter
words
was
in
the
their
thing.
mouths. Yeah.
If Twitter was the thing when Mandela was alive, or MLK, this group of people that we're speaking about now, this like kind of toxic element on the left, they would savage both of these characters. Like MLK Jr. is a really good example of, what did you call it? Idol grabbing?
Yeah.
So like, obviously, right wingers will cite his, I have a dream speech where people are judged by the content of his character, not the color of their skin or whatever. They'll cite that as saying, see, even MLK was against identity politics. Meanwhile, he was like fully advocating for reparations and, these sorts of things. And then lefties will point for sure that the number one thing that they point to for MLK is the letter from the Birmingham jail, when he mentions, white moderates and sort of the kind of obstacle that they pose to the civil rights struggle. But if you actually read the letter, and it's not that long, the letter from the Birmingham jail is like fucking 5 pages. It takes like 15 minutes to read. He was very specifically, I mean, he was kind of speaking in generalities, but he was referencing there was a group of like white pastors that were in the southern states that were complaining that he was doing too much agitating. And so he was specifically responding to them, even though he was speaking in generalities. And in the same letter, I don't know if you know this, in the same letter, in a separate area, he talks about how they had a planned protest in one of the states, like Alabama, I'll just make it up. And a runoff election was scheduled at the same time as their planned protest.
Yeah, and
he
they
talked
delayed
about
it so they didn't want to disrupt the election, right?
Right.
Yeah.
MLK Jr. in the letter from the Birmingham jail was stressing the importance in engaging directly in electoral politics, voting, taking elections seriously. And I find it quite amusing and ironic that the same people that are making the case that, you know, we need to break away from the Democratic Party and we shouldn't vote for Kamala, blah, blah, blah. These are the same people that cite MLK Jr. But MLK Jr. was like, he was smart enough to understand that you have to claw away at power inch by inch. Like you can't just like cede all this ground to conservatives in government because it would make your job harder. Yeah, I just feel like that one always sticks out to me. Like it's funny you mentioned that, but because you're absolutely right. It's like both the left and the right just completely bastardize MLK Jr. for their own, like,
it's everything about
purposes.
it. Like, because I think with both him and Mandela, the more I read about them, it's like they're both so much more like intelligent and mindful than any of their the people who invoke them give them credit for, right? Because when you're looking through Birmingham jail, and like even I thought like MLK was just like some brave dude who was good at like a pastor, you know, like a fucking goofy Christian talking about peace and dreams and equality and all that, and then like it was just like he was like a good speech like figurehead, right? And that's all I thought. But when I'm reading like Birmingham jail and all that, yeah, it's like it's super calculated and it's very you can tell he's like thought everything from like down to the basic morality to the means to the ends. Like it's all very well thought out. So that to the point where even in Birmingham jail, where he's talking about how they would have these self-purification sessions where they would talk about showing people like how to, if you're going to go to a protest, you have to make sure that you can, like, if you're going to stand on the outside, you have to know that you might have to take blows from the cops and not retaliate, because if you retaliate, it's going to look like a fight, not like oppression. If you and making sure to have like the well-trained people on the outside or the veterans on the outside because they can absorb blows, or making sure to search people for weapons, and knowing to go to the right states where you know that the police are actually going to ruffle you up. Because I think when they went to Albany in Georgia, the cops there they were rabid segregationists, but the police chief was clever enough not to antagonize the protesters too much because they didn't want to make a spectacle of it. So basically you just had protests, like protesters marching, but the cops just kind of like gently arresting some of them, guiding the protests into quieter areas, and then nothing came from it. But when they went to Birmingham, it was Birmingham where it was Bull Connor. Was that where he was? The Dixie cop?
I'm not sure.
I think it was. Where that guy was like, he was a nutcase. He was really violent, and that's where they got all the media attention. So, yeah, I don't know. But yeah, people just don't really give these guys any fucking credit. They just use them to justify whatever nonsense they were going to support anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, they were the point of the nonviolence was not to be like perfectly in keeping with Christ's teachings, for example. I mean, they were very calculated about like why they wanted to practice nonviolence, and they were right. Like when Americans saw images and video of Black people being brutalized on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that was a big inflection point for the civil rights movement. These people that was the sacrifice they were making. They were willing to risk not only their personal freedom, but their personal like security, like their well-being, their physical well-being, for the cause. And if you apply that to like a modern lens, there's like two really good contrasting events that happened recently, semi-recently. The first one was in 2020 when all the BLM protests were happening all over the country. I'm not talking about the riots, but the actual protests. I don't know if people in your chat or my chat recall, or if you recall, but there was one thread that somebody posted. It was like a master thread of over 100 videos that people had shot during those protests of cops that were clearly brutalizing like nonviolent protesters. And that became very, very salient. That got people really upset. Nobody likes to see somebody who is, you know, basically not posing any kind of a threat be subject to like physical brutality. And so that was a really effective kind of piece of propaganda. I mean, propaganda in like the neutral sense. It was it was an effective way to garner support for BLM. Now, if you contrast that with like the UCLA protests recently, last year for the Israel stuff, they got nothing but bad press because you had this group of hundreds of students that built a physical encampment. They were basically provoking the police to come in and be violent with them. And then they engaged violently with the police. So the police, when they went into the encampment, the first thing that some of the students did was shoot a fire extinguisher at the cops. And I feel like a lot of those protests where the student protesters were basically picking fights with cops, it did nothing but hurt their cause. It just made people more. Yeah, I mean, I just feel like in so many ways, these people are the worst advocates for these kinds of things.
I don't know about that. I think they're very appropriately representing the movements that they support, because that's what the Axis of Resistance does, right? That's what Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis do. They launch useless fucking attacks and then cry when the retaliation happens. You know, that's about right. Like the guys running with fucking bins turned into shields, running at the cops and falling over when the cops push them back.
Did you see the remix of that where somebody added like the Avengers theme with a kazoo?
Yeah, because that's probably what was in his head, right? Like he was probably thinking about the Riders of Rohan before he like came face to face with that guy.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah, that is I don't know if this is maybe something that's always happened. Like maybe there were loads of dumb protesters in the 60s that history just doesn't remember because they were the ones that didn't achieve anything. Like, I mean, I guess Malcolm X, right? Because he was kind of like useless back in his day. You know, he didn't really actually do all that much.
No, there were examples of counterproductive protests back in the day. I mean, like the protest at the 68 Democratic National Convention, I think, violence like broke out and it ended up like turning people away from their cause. And so, you know, the point of protest is not to do it in a way that's not disruptive. I mean, it's fine to be disruptive. That's like the point of civil disobedience. Mm-hmm. But if you're out there provoking physical altercations with cops, it's just I don't understand the value of that to your cause. It doesn't help anything. And what drove me insane was, especially during those student protests last summer or last year, whenever it was there were like prominent left-wing creators with really big platforms on social media that were like lionizing a lot of the kids that were physically engaging with the police. And I got so pissed when I saw that, because it's like, bro, you're not there, you know, you're not the one that's risking felony assault of a police officer, you know, and these kids are all staring at their phones when they're at these events. They're not just, you know, they're obviously plugged into what social media is saying. And so if you're incentivizing like a kid, like if you're going to try to get a kid all jacked up on adrenaline, so he's going to go like assault a cop, it feels like you're offloading all of the risk onto them, you know, while you're sitting in the comfort of your home. There's nothing stopping you from like joining them at this protest and physically getting in a physical altercation with cops. So that just drove me insane. But what do you think about like, so I assume you would agree that like on social media, the people on the fringes, the people on the extremes generate more discourse than people with like complex or nuanced takes on things. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering first of all, do you agree with that?
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think? I don't know what label you want to apply, but like, what do you think like rational people on the left need to do to build spaces that compete with like the Hassans and the other voices? Because right now, I just feel like they have a crazy outsized influence on the discourse, and I would argue in like really negative ways. And it's just incredibly difficult to, like, for example, if you're going to have a conversation about the rules of war with respect to how to target a hospital, mm-hmm. It's like a really short, concise thing to say, you know, like bombing hospitals is wrong, which, you know, 99 times out of 100, that's true, right? Like a general rule of thumb, and this is what international law says. There's narrow exceptions, but it is a war crime to bomb a hospital that doesn't have any protections. It's really easy to say that and just leave it there. But if you interject with, well, I mean, permanent like immunity from being bombed just doesn't really make sense if you think about it. It just like, I experienced so much crazy vitriol in my mentions because a bunch of like prominent left-wingers started like talking about me saying that.
Yeah, but that's because they don't. Well, first of all, okay, so I think for half the people, it's probably just because it's like, it's a position that feels bad to say. Because like, targeting a hospital with military anything, like, it doesn't matter if there are soldiers or like threats in that building. It's like, it still feels bad to say. People just want to go with the thing that feels good, and that's probably just where it begins and ends. With other people, there's no point explaining any of this to them, right? Like, these are the same people who still think the fucking pager attack was as an indiscriminate terrorist operation that was just all about murdering civilians, even though Hezbollah and the IRGC admitted themselves that those pagers were for their own operatives. Like, and that's right. Most of the vast majority of people who died were Hezbollah. The vast majority of people who got injured were Hezbollah by those pagers because they were for Hezbollah. They were targeting Hezbollah. And just because, like, yeah, sorry, if you have a group that hides among civilians, sometimes you're going to kill civilians as well along with them. But as far as like the level of precision, you're never going to get better than that pager attack. But people condemn that anyway. It's not because they think it wasn't perfect enough, right? it's not because of the two kids who very tragically fucking got killed as well. It's not. They're not upset because of that, though. They would still be upset if those two kids didn't die. They're upset because they want those guys to win. So as far as like the Middle East goes, though, if you're like a center-left activist in the US, like, what are you trying to achieve by talking to tankies about hospitals? Probably, like, I don't know, the idea would be there. There's not that much Westerners can do in the Middle East anyway, even especially with Trump in. What the fuck do these protesters think they're going to achieve now with Trump in office? You think you're going to scream at Trump and he's going to start talking about ceasefires and aid and arms embargoes? Like, fuck no.
Right. Well, their position is that the Democratic Party is maximally evil and therefore indistinguishable from the Republican Party. Like, I don't know why I agreed to this, because this guy is like immediately just wildly bad faith. But I agreed to talk to a leftist this coming Tuesday about the situation. And yeah, there was just a lot of discourse about like the bombing of the hospitals that was in my mentions for like several days.
Yeah.
You mentioned sort of like the things that these people cling to, the things that these people believe in that are contradicted by like Hezbollah's own words or actions, or Hamas's own words or actions. So like a really good example of this is like, if there's some kind of Israeli strike on, you know, an apartment building, a university, a hospital, and they put forth evidence or claim that there was some kind of tunnel system underneath, like they like to mock that. They like to say like, oh, there's a tunnel everywhere, isn't there? Every single bomb, there's a tunnel. And then you
but
can
Hamas agrees with that. Like, it fucking
right. Yeah,
I love this.
You can find Hamas leadership. No, yes, they are bragging. I just watched a speech last night of somebody who I think is fucking dead now, but a Hamas leadership person who was saying that they have 300 miles of tunnels under Gaza. Like, they do not deny that they have like hundreds of miles of tunnels underneath Gaza. And yet the very notion of this being a thing, like these leftists mock that. Anyways, it's just, yeah, this stuff is
you will find that's very common in a lot of this discourse. Is you will literally see Israel says a thing, Hamas says a thing, leftist disagrees. That's like, that will happen very often. It's the same with the pagers. Nasrallah came out on fucking day 2 and said, oh yeah, this has caused a huge blow to Hezbollah, not to Lebanon, to Hezbollah. This has massively fucked us. He said it openly, okay? So it's funny how they're like, but then I'm still looking on social media and people are like, these pagers were spread among the civilian population. Like, these could have been any civilian. I don't even think to this day there's a report of someone, like even a bystander who wasn't holding a pager who got injured by that.
Right.
So it's like, yeah, the pagers hit the people who were holding the pagers. And in 1 or 2 cases, that was like the civilian family members of the Hezbollah operatives who were asking for them to get the pager for them, like the 2 kids who died. But with everything else, it was like, yeah, they're all admitting this, but meanwhile, and Israel's saying this, but somehow, like, it's like, I consent, but what about me? All 5,000 miles away, saying that I think this targeted civilians. Like, no. At the end of the day, it seems like both the people on the ground agree on this, but you don't. Same with the tunnels. Yeah, Hamas will tell you that they have 500 kilometers of tunnels. The IDF says they have 500 kilometers of tunnels. That's just like, why do I need a fucking white person in America, in fucking LA, to tell me otherwise?
It was really incredible timing because like 2 days after all these lefties felt like they did like a coordinated attack on me because I said it was just like something random I said during a stream reaction. And this little thing got clipped, and then all of a sudden, like multiple people posting about it, and I've got all these deranged replies. Me talking about like the narrow exceptions to bombing a hospital, and then fucking 2 days later, Israel kills Hamas's military leadership person. The Sinwar, was it Sinwar's like half brother or his
So I'm
brother?
not. Yeah, it's Mohammed Sinwar. I don't know if he's confirmed dead though, but
Right. Yeah.
it seemed to be that the main targets were him and two other people, but I have no idea. I have no idea what
And who
actually,
did?
if he's dead
And they
yet.
had to fuck. And they had to do a strike right next to a fucking hospital. Like if what they said was true, he was hiding underneath the hospital. So, I mean, like I guess to balance things out, lately I find myself more sympathetic to using the word genocide because of the blockade, because of the humanitarian aid blockade. What are your thoughts about that?
I think if they don't, so based on what they're saying about, again, you can even hear this from within the IDF now. Like even the chief of staff has said we only have a matter of weeks before it's like an irreversible path to humanitarian crisis, like full on. So I think if they don't let aid in before the end of this month, I'm not going to care if anyone calls it genocide. I wouldn't split hairs on that, regardless of what they're
Yeah,
intending to get out of it.
it's pretty. I mean, and I think this is a really good.
is actually more reactionary, both in its adherence to parliamentarianism and also its, in particular, the YCL, its positions on migration. Um, with both CPG, and CPB, obviously, I don't know. I think a great number of the listeners here have taken notice of at least one of the flags in my bio. I've been called a great many things on the basis of those flags, and one of them, CPG, you just can't actually be trans in any way. So, not the biggest fan of them. I don't think they have a particularly good line on it, insofar as they deny it completely as any sort of social condition which needs to be acknowledged. CPP is bad, but at the very least, they'll sort of make a show of, um, you know, quote unquote, dealing with the medical issues therein. So, I am not the biggest fan of CPGBML. I don't mind the work of like the Stalin Society and Bill Bland, and I've read some of Hartford Bra's work. I don't think it's too bad either, but I'm not particularly enamored with them. I haven't been particularly impressed with them, and also I think they are not insusceptible to degrees of opportunism, given the fact that they attempted to have an alliance with Galloway's Workers' Party, and that fell apart very quickly due
Yeah.
to internal disputes. So I don't know. They haven't been particularly. I appreciate the World Anti-Imperialist platform to some extent. I do have my criticisms therein, but I do appreciate it. Um, you know, not the biggest fan of either. I don't think they're particularly advanced theoretically for the most part. I think a lot of their criticisms of the RC. I'm not a fan of the RCI by any stretch. Frankly, I find them
Is that
extremely
the
annoying.
Trotskyist kind of
Yes, one
group?
of them, Alan Woods. Alan Woods is mainly stationed here, and I'm quite, quite, extremely critical of Trotsky. As I do still consider myself an ML, but I think they lapse too quickly into some sort of intellectual laziness with that beyond sort of it, the partial denial of like AES as a category. I think is a valid criticism, but to just sort of say they're loyal opposition, I think is foolish, and doesn't really address a lot of the issues that they actually deal with in practice.
Yeah, my perspective on all of these different left parties um is actually fairly like open. I really believe that the best horse should win. But there is so much complacency and the lack of effort and, as you say, intellectual laziness. But going back to the whole the trans issue, you know, they call England, what do they call it? The turf isle,
Fine. I
right?
think that that is accurate as someone
It's
who's lived here. Yeah.
it's very discriminatory, and I think that if any left party is actively taking like a dogmatic stance against trans people, that is just it's reactionary in the sense that I don't think that trans people and like drawing this like culture war boundary against trans people really has anything to do with
This is
partisan
too
left
good.
wing politics. And obviously, my view is consistent with our party. We're anti discrimination. And so, I guess the first question I want to ask you is I noticed I just did a little bit of research into what you've been saying about ACP, and I noticed that you have rightly drawn this distinction between the kind of mass online spontaneous apparatus of the guerrillas and the party itself. And that is something I do want to question you on because I feel like a lot of our critics are kind of assuming an isomorphism between the two, that, oh, any random account on Twitter is faithfully representing the views of the party's constitution and the party's program. And then they're clipping out of context or clipping random accounts and kind of holding the ACP to account to these random people online. And that's where I think a lot of our unfortunate reputation of having super like dogmatic culture war stances comes from, because a lot of people in the online element are commentating on like culture war topics, in my view, in excess. So what do you think about that?
So yeah, I mean, I do recognize that there is a distinction, but I think that to the extent that there is a distinction, it's intentionally blurred within at least the inner workings of infrared from what I've seen. And I was actually in the infrared Discord for a little bit because I think some people might remember this was a while back, but I used to be a Midwestern Marks fan. I was actually on one of their videos. I discussed Dugan for a bit. Um, and so I think as regards that, like infrared, whilst it is distinct from ACP, is nonetheless, I think you'll agree to some extent intertwined with its development, both online and sort of the notion of the guerrillas fighting this additional information war and attempting to sort of police the borders of discourse and adjust the kind of gravity of political discussion. And whilst I do
Right.
actually respect the sort of cultivation of those techniques, I genuinely do. I think that one, it's sort of played a part in the specific appropriation and deployment of culture war talking points, which I don't think is entirely devoid from some aesthetics of your party, including certain individual members of your executive board, in particular, I think Rev Lascaris or RTSG, as is more commonly referred to, um, is yeah not against it. And whilst I do recognise the fact that you stated that people shouldn't be dogmatically anti-trans, one of my big concerns as regards specifically the ACP's attitude towards trans people is I think Noah's appearances on the Morbid Symptoms podcast, who are quite dogmatically anti-trans in that way, as well as members of the ACP who I've spoken to online, because I think there's a kind of uh, misconception of what a trans politics has to deal with, particularly. But we can get into that with a sort of more general critique of the ACP. But I do think that I think one of the big problems is the distinction, but nonetheless the blurriness of that distinction at points, and the reason as to why it is distinct, given the fact that you have in the Discord Haas kind of talking about effectively cultivating an almost independent semi-intelligence agency when he refers to like Nikki in particular.
So there's a lot of points there, but I think what it's good to go to or good to return to is always the very basics. And obviously, when you're returning to the basics of Marxist-Leninist canon, you have to be aware that you can't just apply things one for one, because we're speaking of fundamentally different times, and the information landscape and the internet age is a lot different than what we're dealing with in the works of Lenin, for example. But what is emphasized in Lenin's What Is to Be Done is there's obviously this trend of economism, which is really emphasizing this spontaneous kind of organic development of the class struggle from among workers' consciousness and a political consciousness that's just kind of organically arising from within the masses, right? And economism is basically just saying that we need to tail behind this at all costs, right? Uh, because that is the real movement. That's the development. Um, and they don't really understand or properly place like what is the role of a vanguard party, right? Um,
Hmm.
and so when I look at the kind of dialectic between the spontaneous organic developments in the masses and a party, I really see a strong example and a strong defense of having the guerrillas and having um, this spontaneous element online. And as you say, it is a very you at least concede that there is a beneficial thing going on here, at least to some extent, at least maybe in form. Um, and I think it's important to realize that the dialectic that's always going to be happening between like spontaneously organized massed elements that arise up and around a party and up and around communism as a argument and as a worldview. Those elements are not going to be pure, right? There's always going to be excesses and mistakes. And that's where a party can come in and sort that out and kind of give voice and give punctuation and a grammar to otherwise kind of vague, amorphous nebula of different mass opinions and different things going on. Um, and we actually saw that recently. I feel like a lot of people who really are trying to criticize the ACP do not listen to what the communication between the chairman of our party, Hawes, they do not listen to the communications that are being given down to the guerrillas. And there was actually a pretty firm lecture that was given, I believe, last week on
Hmm.
really putting a leash on some of the useless, demeaning, vicious kind of behavior that is much more of an echo chamber and much more of a self congratulatory kind of circle jerk mentality where we do not actually seek to be professional representatives of our party and to actually gain discursive supremacy with good arguments and solid refutation, but instead we just come in and anyone who is critiquing the party or anyone who even vaguely gestures at signaling against the ACP, people just come in and they're insulting and demeaning and rude without any real substance. And that is something that has been critiqued, as well as the the culture war kind of tendency in general. And it's difficult to say like, yes, we have overcome this obsession with the culture war and like having these dogmatic like super like conservative positions, because some people in our party genuinely do retain positions of that kind. And of course, when we're talking about the guerrillas, we're speaking of like, a vast, anonymous, unnamed mass of people. And so it's hard to really sort out all of the excesses of that. But I think what we have to understand is if we want to have like a mass viral media polarity and we want to have a control over the discourse rather than just being kind of at the whim of whatever people are just what generally talking about and this quote unquote left space, if we want to have that kind of polarity and we want to have that kind of discursive sphere where we have a communist party and a communist position, we have to be willing to sacrifice some of the purity of narrative and some of the purity of the expression of support for our party in return for the great amount of gains we get from having people who are active online, who are really supporting our party and defending it and pushing it out there to people.
Okay, so could I respond to that very
Yes, yeah.
semi briefly? So, whilst I don't disagree insofar as you do have the spontaneous elements that arise, both as the fundamental elements which constitute a party, which, you know, that was kind of the origins of the ACP. You had infrared, you had Midwestern Marx, you had elements of the CPUSA and PCUSA. Um, but also, specifically the way that the guerrillas were deployed, have been deployed in the past, there was a degree of almost encouraging those excesses and this sort of ragging, as can be seen from I think quite a few screenshots of basically going, this person is attacking our thing, go 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 go, flag, or then subsequently when it comes to, you know, the promotion of the post and discussion over the we'll say ethical character of utilizing bots as well. And that does give me a degree of concern insofar as that it's not merely just you know, a degree of excess which emerges from a spontaneous movement, but a behavior that was certainly in infrared's intermediate and toward as it was becoming the kind of force online that would then become the basis for the ACP. This behavior was in part cultivated. It wasn't just sort of a degree of excess, right? It was actively deployed and utilized as a means of. And again, I understand what you said in terms of sacrificing some of the purity, but I don't think that's quite just sacrificing some of the purity. And as regards the talking to given to, that was in response to the what one could call the Pendleton affair. I think that's what her name was, or whatever. Um, and the sort of great disgrace a lot of the guerrillas made of themselves and the subsequent hours. And that was a very clear indication that this model, at least up until a certain point, doesn't really work. Or at the very least, the content imbued in this form of the guerrilla, with the specific kind of attitude and the willingness to project this excess in a very deliberate way, has been cultivated in the past. So I think I don't necessarily disagree with you in terms of the basic formality of what you said, but as regards the specific instance which infrared and the guerrillas represent, there has been a degree of cultivation of those sorts of attitudes.
Yeah. As for the the quote unquote Pendleton affair, just to be clear, that was reined in very quickly. Um, and goth people are allowed in the party. I think some people uh went too far, and it really projects insecurity more than it does any discursive dominance when this random lady is like making joke threats and we're like, oh my god, you're trying to kill us, what the fuck, you fascist, it's kind of silly. um and that was reined in, and that would be an example of how some of the excesses can be reined in. um as for It was something that was understood and acknowledged from the very outset that there would be this problem of, well, who's actually representing the party and who's more a supporter of the party, and who is this account that we really don't have any grasp on, who is kind of carrying our banner but is not really representing us at all. Um, and so obviously you can go to the ACP website, and we have blockchain for that specific purpose of being able to, we have like a signature that pertains not just to every chapter, like every official chapter account, but also everyone who's an official cadre in the party also has that signature, right? So
Mhm.
I think that is a good kind of kind of I think I think that is how you can have accountability as to who is who in a meaningful way. And a lot of our critics really just don't care. Like they really don't care to look at the ACP in good faith and to kind of separate out what is excess and what is not. Um as for this being cultivated, I will agree that it was at different times cultivated. But even then, it's like who is the example? Who's the quote unquote mascot of like the ACP reply guy? It's Volk Vulture, and I think if you're familiar with Volk Vulture, you can go to his account and see his replies, and the quality is really what should be aimed for, right? Vogue Vulture always pulls up with sources and solid refutation. He rarely engages in demeaning insults or belittling. Um, and I think that is the quality. And even Haas has pointed to this. That is the kind of quality we want to look for. Of course, not everyone can or has to be like this super serious, just logical like person who's pulling up with the sources and the refutation. A good amount of banter and like like calling people's bullshit, right? Like not taking everyone who's critiquing us that seriously, because some of the people who critique us are genuinely not that serious, but in general, I think the Volk Vulture standard is what we are pointing to as a party for the information war, in terms of being a reply guy and going in and refuting and asking questions and kind of asserting the truth and setting the record straight with our party. So that's the ideal, and that's kind of the golden center, and everything that strays out from that, uh the further and further it goes, the more you can point to incidences where it gets reined in, right? We had a recent like public example of someone who was forced to do self crit publicly on his timeline by the party because of something he said that was very out of line. And you can see, and I mean, it's completely public. Like we have all of our ops are stalking our Discord, right? Where a lot of the information war is kind of being controlled. You can see when there's like a major and Haas is like disciplining people and reining it in. Um, and I think that is sufficient. And obviously it's developing in the sense that like there will be more problems, right? There will be a constant contradiction between the party as a formal apparatus and those who are representing it. Um, and over time, I anticipate that there will be more discipline and more professionalism in that regard, because we are growing out of a phase where infrared was just an online kind of, not to be too like demeaning, but it was kind of an online kind of dirtbag leftist phenomena. And now we're moving into an actual professional party. And so the growing pains and the the excess that has to be kind of trimmed away, that's a developing thing. Um, and I am especially critical. I don't mind people who do culture war commentary as long as it's rooted in actual good argumentation and good like it's actually good faith and it's actually like a serious matter. But I am especially critical of anyone who is demeaning, slurring, or really uh doing things that you would not say to a person in real life, just the kind of like the kind of agency you get with anonymity to just be an awful person. I don't think anyone in our party should be an awful person. I think, not to be all hippy dippy, but I do think a communist party is in some sense it has to be all loving, because communism is not like a clique, it is not a tribe. It seeks to represent all of society, right? And it seeks to transform all of society. So we have to have accountability and responsibility for that claim that we're for all of society and not just some and not just our clique, you know?
Mhm. I saw someone having a good old laugh. I think your message of peace and love to the fellow proletariat is being taken semi-ironically, but that is perhaps to the gorillas to decide.
Yeah, there's an internal fight. Some of the people who are in here are more interested in the enabling, like wanting to be aggressive, and they think that is the correct approach, being very aggressive. And to those people, I would say like there's a way to combine aggression and actual like good faith like refutation in a way that is balanced and not like excessive in in a negative way.
Yeah. I mean, again, I don't necessarily disagree with that. It is just also there is, and perhaps you will understand my skepticism as regards to obviously you have specific cases of these sort of self-crit, and which is I think come more so out of the necessity you find in order to be able to present yourself seriously